Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 79, Joseph Fouché, Napoleon's sinister police minister. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of our listeners that if they'd like bonus content and ad-free content, please go to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon. If you'd like to support our podcast in other ways, please go to YouTube and hit the subscribe button. Or go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts and give us a review and rating. As always, we appreciate your support. Now, on with the show. We have a special guest on the line once again, my good friend, Michael Brors. Hello, Michael.
Hello, John. Nice to speak to you again.
Michael was on a few episodes ago. He did a great episode with me on Talleyrand. And he has a number of books, one of which I'm reading right now, Napoleon's Spirit of the Age, 1805 to 1810. And they've recently won an award. Correct, Michael?
It was indeed, yeah. It was very pleasing. The Elizabeth Longford, the annual Elizabeth Longford Prize, they gave me the 20th anniversary Silver Citation Bowl for the whole trilogy.
Congrats.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a pretty prestigious thing. I mean, 20th anniversary. That's great.
Yeah, it was lovely dinner, great occasion. Yeah.
Very good. And today, who is the gentleman that we're going to be discussing?
Joseph Fouché.
Joseph Fouché. So very similar to Talleyrand. If we did a thumbnail sketch of the police minister of Napoleon. He's a survivor, and like Talleyrand, he was duplicitous in his dealings with Emperor Napoleon. And people will ask all the time, like, why did Napoleon keep these kind of guys around him and just not throw them in jail or execute them? But like Talleyrand, he had a vast network of supporters and spies, right? Like Napoleon needed this guy.
Yeah, he needed him. He was there from the very beginning because Napoleon couldn't do without him.
Mm-hmm.
Don't forget that Napoleon is not in a strong position when he comes to power.
Right.
And Fouché has been the Minister of Police under the Directory, the previous regime. He's been around a lot, like Talleyrand, knows everybody. And Napoleon simply is not in a position to get rid of him.
Yeah.
And he's not in a position to execute him either.
Mm-hmm.
He knows everybody. He has all the dirt on everybody.
Mm-hmm.
In that sense, he's not unlike J. Edgar Hoover. He's been there a while. He knows everything.
Right.
You may not like him, but you have to deal with him.
Right.
It's in that sense, perhaps less influential politically than Talleyrand, but far more powerful.
And just for the record, Napoleon didn't invent secret police. There's been secret police force organizations for a lot of regimes around the world. And I think a lot of people blame Fouché and Napoleon for kind of inventing this organization or group of organizations.
Oh, that's quite right. I mean, the Fouché brought in his own men.
Mm-hmm.
He created his own structure.
Mm-hmm.
But that this is a very shady world we're in. There were secret police organizations under the old regime,
right,
under the king. How much of that gets incorporated by the revolutionaries is rather hard to tell.
Mm-hmm.
But a fair bit of it is. But certainly the revolution is pretty big on creating networks of informers,
right,
and things that work through it all. And right. Fouché inherits those. He was part of them in the early days when he was more junior.
Mm-hmm.
And he takes it over. And one of the most interesting things about the regime in its early days, I think needs to be thought about a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
This applies to Talleyrand too. They are part of a balancing act. As you were saying, that Talleyrand's links to the old regime. He was a noble. Fouché's links go back to the very radical revolutionaries.
Mm-hmm.
But he was too radical for Robespierre.
Right.
That's a story in itself. I mean, Talleyrand was in danger. Talleyrand backs the anti-Robespierre coup in the summer of 1794 because Robespierre pulled him in as being too extremist.
Right.
and he's worried about what Robespierre is going to do to him for being too far to the left.
Yeah.
And so he gets involved in the plot to get rid of him.
Yeah.
But the thing is that they have huge networks, these two. Talleyrand in the diplomatic corps, Fouché in the police. You can't get rid of them. You need the expertise that they can bring you. But there's also a political element to this element. That Napoleon has this policy through the early years of the regime, what he calls twin prong. The French words are raillement and amalgame. Rallying and amalgamation, it would be in English, but it doesn't quite do it. It's kind of reconciliation, fusion, balance.
Right.
It's not unlike de Gaulle after World War II. Collaborators were there. They exist. We can't get rid of everybody. We've got to balance this and build everybody in.
Right.
And Napoleon's attitude was that the revolution's problem is that it's always about the few, the narrow, dependable few. Well, we've got to get away from that and build out the big tent and bring in everybody who's reasonable, prepared to cooperate. And these two come to epitomize it in the public mind. Madame de Stael, who's a critic of Napoleon, and very much of the middle course of the revolution in her background. I mean, she despises this and says what he's done is he's brought in the two extremes. Yeah. And they represent it. And in a way they do. But they are key to this balancing act. But he has to do with that because he needs them. Right. He sees that part of the Directory's problem was that their diplomacy was cack-handed because they didn't rely on the experienced diplomats. Well, he wants to change that. Josephine's a big influence on him there. Yeah. And Talleyrand is the guy to do it. Where when you look at the police, now this is the other side of Napoleon that's very much a revolutionary. I can't do without Fouché because he's too dangerous and he knows too much. But I know as much as anybody that our real enemy now are the royalists and the foreign powers. And Fouché is on the same side there as me. Right. He's a revolutionary, and when it comes right down to it, so am I.
And we'll get to that because there's a number of assassination attempts coming up. But let's kind of dive into the early part of his life. Joseph Fouché was born in May 1759 near Nantes, France, to Julien and Marie Fouché. What do we know about his upbringing? Clearly, he wasn't an aristocrat like Talleyrand.
No, but he's from a very well-off family. His father was a sea captain, but that's not the whole story. His father was also a major importer, because Nantes is one of the big Atlantic ports. Along with Bordeaux, it's the big Atlantic port. Mainly spices. Pretty wealthy, made a lot of money. He was one of several children. I think there were about 5. And he had a good education. He was educated by the Oratorians, showed a real aptitude for science. His father was very keen for him to follow in the family business. Merchant navy, importer, exporter. But they were hands-on people. I mean, they did not sit in an office. They were sea captains as well. Obviously, he's not physically fit for that, really, and he doesn't want to do it. His father dies, and that rather changes the family's fortunes when he's quite young. Now, it's a moot point whether he actually became an ordained priest or not, but he was certainly on the way to ordination. But because he's very bright, he he stays with the Oratorian order, and they employ him as a teacher, first around the Nantes area, and eventually in some of their more prestigious institutions in Paris. And this is a very interesting sideline to his story. He's sent to Arras in the mid 1780s, late 1780s. Yep. And that's where Robespierre comes from. Yes. And that's where he meets Robespierre.
That's my next question. Yeah.
Yeah, he's teaching in the Oratorian College there. He meets Robespierre, and there's a guy an officer in the garrison there called Lazare Carnot, who will become the organizational genius of the revolutionary armies.
The organizer of victory. Yeah.
Yeah, the organizer of victory. He's in the garrison at Arras. And they all frequent the same Enlightenment salon, learned society.
Mm-hmm.
So they did know each other. I don't know what they made of each other. We don't have that kind of detail.
He also becomes a Freemason in 1788, which is right before the French Revolution.
That's when he's in Arras, yeah.
So I guess this is when he starts leaning and meeting with Jacobins and becomes anti-clerical and somewhat of a staunch Republican.
Where he makes a name, but also nearly blows it, is during the Terror. The Committee of Public Safety, of which Robespierre was a member,
right,
sends out representatives on mission.
Mm-hmm.
That is, deputies of the convention are sent out to trouble spots in France, and there are plenty of them, basically to put down royalist rebellions,
right,
counter-revolutionary rebellions. And Fouché, for a while, becomes, because he knows Robespierre, he becomes one of the main players of that, a representative on mission, who's always sent to the hot spots.
Mm-hmm.
But his actual links in the convention, his close, these things are very fluid, John. But his, there weren't political parties as we know them at all.
Mm-hmm.
But his close links are not to Robespierre.
Mm-hmm.
They are to a faction called the Hébertistes, who cluster around a guy called Hébert, who's not actually a deputy. He's the deputy mayor of Paris.
Mm.
And they are generally much further to the left than Robespierre, much more anti-clerical, much more violent,
right,
in their approach to things. And that crowd, there are several other guys in it, like Fouché, Collot d'Herbois. Collot d'Herbois and Fouché team up at Lyon. Fouché goes out to the west of France, where he comes from a few times, but his big thing comes when he said, the city of Lyon revolts against the revolutionary government.
Correct.
Now, Lyon's the second biggest city in France.
Right.
Yeah. Well, maybe third after Marseille. And it's the biggest commercial industrial center in France.
Right.
And it's basically in revolt.
Mm-hmm.
And Collot d'Herbois is sent down there, and Fouché as his sidekick to sort this thing out. They're the kind of Starsky and Hutch of the team. They don't mess around. You know what I mean? These guys do not mess around.
Right.
And they really do go down there and they go berserk.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the thing, there's a massacre when they finally take Lyon. The way they take the town was with incredible brutality.
They have troops with them. It's not just these two guys. They have a number of troops with them, and yeah, it's quite violent.
Well, they're not just troops. They're sort of revolutionary volunteers from Paris.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these are the psychos.
Mm-hmm.
They are. No, they are. And
right.
they firebomb the town.
Mm-hmm.
And people are trying to swim across the river to escape it all. And they start shooting them.
Mm-hmm.
And then they start systematically blowing up parts of the city.
Right.
And they kill about at least 1,500 people.
Yeah.
Probably closer to 1,700.
Yeah.
And that's the point. Like, Collot's the first one brought back to the convention. And Robespierre says to him, okay, how are things going in Lyon? And Collot smiles and he says, the town of Lyon no longer exists. And I said, okay, you're not going back there.
Right.
And then he recalls Fouché. You see, and he says to Fouché, look, you two are a couple of nuts.
Mm-hmm.
And that was right out of order. We've got to live with these people.
Right.
Well, Fouché said, well, the idea that it won't be any more to live with.
Yeah.
And he said, look, and that's when Fouché thinks Robespierre is going to turn on us.
Famously in Lyon, he and his psycho troops chain together a few hundred rebels and blast them with cannons outside the city, which earns him the moniker, the, quote, executioner of Lyon, end quote.
Yeah.
I think one of the differences between him and Talleyrand, just to go back to our original point, I think Talleyrand always had France's interests at heart. With Fouché, it's almost like I don't know if he's just concerned about himself or who the current political party in charge is. I never know, and maybe this is part of the interest in this character, who he's concerned about. Is it France? Is it the government in charge? Is it himself? Like I can't put a pin on what is his driving goal.
Well, I think at this stage during the terror, that he is an arch terrorist.
Mm-hmm.
He sees the Republic, he sees France imperiled by these rebels within. This is happening in the middle of the foreign war, remember?
Right.
This is this is happening in the middle of a foreign invasion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there he would say he was acting in the interests of France.
Right.
That his France, Republican France.
Right.
Extreme Republican France.
Mm-hmm.
As time goes on, I very much agree with you, John. His motives are very difficult to discern. Is he acting in the interests of France?
Right.
Or is he acting in his own interests? It's often hard to tell.
Famously, in 1792, he votes for the death of King Louis XVI, which will come back to haunt him later, but that's also very extreme.
Well, a lot of them did. I mean, a lot of people voted for his death.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that ties him irrevocably to the revolution
mm-hmm.
for a very long time, because Louis XVIII then immediately declares in several declarations, the most infamous one is at Verona,
mm-hmm.
but there were about 3 that were issued categorically saying, if I am ever restored to the French throne, I am going to execute the people who executed my brother and
right.
my nephew. I'm going to execute the people who voted for the execution of my brother, and that's not negotiable. That is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You had no right to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And he's my brother. What do you expect me to do?
Right.
And so that everybody who took part in that, just like everybody who bought national lands, the lands that belonged to the clergy or the emigre nobles that were put up for sale,
mm-hmm.
he says, you're going to lose that property.
Right.
These guys are tied to the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So in one sense, you don't have to worry about it being loyal to the revolution. He's made his bed, he lies in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something Napoleon plays on with everybody and with Fouché.
Mm-hmm.
Look, you may have all the dirt you think you want on me, on my family, on my friends, but you know as well as I do that you've got nowhere else to go.
Right.
You have to stick by me, because what's the alternative?
Mm-hmm.
But in 1814, basically the Allied leaders sit Louis XVIII down and say, you back off.
Right.
If you want to be restored, you have to drop that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not as simple as you think.
Right. And it's like you said before, when you have a fractured society, as you did during the Revolution and when Napoleon took over and when Louis XVIII came back in 1814, you have to make an amalgamation of certain elements, even if you don't like some of those elements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so getting back to our timeline, as we were talking about, Robespierre was appalled by the atrocities committed by Fouché and his cronies and wanted him purged and expelled for the Jacobins. But again, Fouché is kind of able to read the tea leaves to see that Robespierre's power is waning. Do we know how involved Fouché was in Robespierre's eventual downfall?
Frankly, we don't.
Okay.
That's part of the guy's genius.
Mm-hmm.
We know that an awful lot of people he was close to in the Hébertist faction, because Hébert had been purged by Robespierre not long before, very brutally. So they're all worried for themselves. Are we next?
Right.
Because we're the kind of leftovers. But we know, say, that Collot d'Herbois and Billaud Varennes, who were good friends of Fouché's, colleagues of him, and politically associated with them on the far left, they were heavily involved in the coup.
Mm-hmm.
So Fouché, we don't know. We don't know how involved almost anybody was in Primaire,
right.
in Thermidor.
Yep.
It's a very shady business. A guy Colin Jones, an old friend of mine, has written a very good book about Thermidor. And even Colin probably knows more about it than anybody now.
Mm-hmm.
I think certainly writing in English, and I think even he's not quite sure what role Fouché plays.
Yeah.
I think the answer, that part of the solution is that, as he argues, he doesn't actually play a role.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
You know, and we'll see this again several times in his career.
Yeah, and I guess that's why they call it intrigues. You don't know where it started, or
No,
yeah,
but you do know whose side he's going to be on.
Yeah,
because he's afraid of Robespierre.
right.
Yeah.
So, in the ensuing Directory government, Fouché is somewhat relegated to the sidelines, 1795, 1796.
Mm-hmm.
However, Director Barras names him the French ambassador to the Cisalpine Republic in Italy. But he's soon removed from that position, returns to Paris, 1799. Around this time, he becomes involved with the rising star that is Napoleon. Do we know how these two kind of met?
Well, the people he really knew, not quite sure how he met Napoleon, but the people he really knew well, close to Napoleon, were his brothers Joseph and Lucien.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph, I think, he met through Talleyrand. Lucien was pretty well connected to most of the ex-Jacobins.
Yeah, he hung out in the clubs and all that.
That's right, and he so he and Fouché knew each other that way. He knew Josephine a bit too. Fouché's low profile 95 to 96, because that tends to be a right-wing directory that does not like terrorists or ex-terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
That's more Talleyrand's time. 96 to 97 particularly is
Mm-hmm.
when the directory moved to the left.
Mm-hmm.
So Fouché's a bit more welcome. And of course he comes in as Minister of Police because probably during his time during the terror as an Hébertiste, he's built up an incredible spy network and an incredible policing network, generally, not just spies.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's very useful. And that's when it emerges in 1798-99,
Right.
how powerful Fouché is. You know, even though it's a quiet kind of power, that Napoleon is very wary of him.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they know each other. I mean, they don't openly dislike each other or oppose each other, but they're very wary of each other in a way that Napoleon and Talleyrand are working together and not wary of each other.
Right.
You know, they are working together well. And it's really through Talleyrand and through Joseph and Lucien that they say in the run-up to Brumaire that you've got to engage with Talleyrand. You know, you've got to get him on side here. Got to get him involved. And what I find most interesting about his involvement in the coup of Brumaire is his non-involvement.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you said to me earlier, what did he do in Thermidor? Well, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But compared to a lot of people, let's face it, he did nothing.
Yeah.
But they knew what side he was on. So he and Napoleon broker a deal
Mm-hmm.
that Brumaire that look, all Napoleon can get him to do is say, will you stand aside? Will you stay neutral?
Mm-hmm.
Just stay out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And Fouché says, yeah, I will stay out of it and see how it goes. If it succeeds, you can count on me. If you blow it, I'll turn on you.
Right.
But I will, on the day, I will stay out of it. And in that sense, how he's already booked his seat, you know, Napoleon goes in there beholden to him because he did nothing.
Right.
And so keep that network intact. And more or less the implication is this is going to be perceived as a left-wing coup.
Right.
The royalists are not going to like this. You are going to need all the support from the left you can get.
Mm-hmm.
This is something people often forget. Talleyrand's, Fouché's whole police network, right, was almost entirely composed of ex-Jacobins.
Mm-hmm.
Napoleon's police were Jacobins.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes their safe haven. This guy has a Jacobin background. We'll get him into the police.
Right.
We can rely on him.
Yeah.
And Fouché's all booked that up for himself. But at Brumaire, he doesn't do anything. He stands aside and lets it happen. They don't know whether it's going to work.
Correct.
And even when it works, they don't know if it's going to last.
Yeah, and it almost didn't work.
That's right.
Got thrown out. Yeah. So.
And there's a small matter of the war.
Yeah, they're that.
They could win. They could win it inside France and then lose it if they blow the war.
Right.
And everybody's been through this.
Mm-hmm.
The revolution has been 10 years of uncertainty, of chaos, crisis, perpetual crisis.
Yeah.
So that everybody looks over their shoulder.
Well, let's jump ahead now a little bit in the timeline. Obviously the coup goes well. Napoleon begins to centralize Paris and his government in Paris. I guess the power of the police, though, I think is greatly enhanced with the December 1800 assassination attempt of Napoleon and the Machine Infernal plot.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to give us a quick overview of that plot and how this plot helped Fouché strengthen his position?
Well, the plot itself, the Infernal Machine, is pretty horrendous, actually. It's a royalist plot.
Yeah.
And it's basically it's something like a car bomb, which is meant to blow them all, Napoleon and Josephine and his mom, blow them all to kingdom come the way they operate. And there is an explosion in the carriage ahead. There are fatalities.
Right.
They escape. I mean, unscathed. Things didn't quite work out the way it was supposed to without going into lots and lots of detail. It leads to a witch hunt.
Right.
And to cut a long story short, Napoleon uses as a chance to turn on the left as well as the right.
Mm-hmm.
Turn on the Jacobins, blame it on the Jacobins, when it was really the royalists.
Mm-hmm.
But arrest the royalists at the same time under the cover. And Fouché and the police prove particularly adept at that.
Mm-hmm.
And he almost emerges from it saying, "Look, you need me."
Mm-hmm.
Because this isn't the Infernal Machine isn't the only assassination attempt on him.
No, it's dozens. Yeah.
As far as I know, the estimates I would trust. I was talking to another biographer of Napoleon about this recently.
Mm-hmm.
It was certainly over 60.
Oh, yeah.
So this is a perpetual threat.
Right.
I mean, this is one of the big levers Napoleon can use to get himself made consul for life and eventually emperor. They say, look, what happens to all this if something happens to me?
Mm-hmm.
And this is not a theoretical question. I'm not even fighting in a military campaign at the minute. I could be killed in the war.
Yeah.
Leading my troops, but we're in a period of peace at the minute.
Yeah.
And they're still trying to blow me up every 5 minutes.
Right.
So we've got to start planning for what happens after me.
Mm-hmm.
And Fouché is able to step in and say, look, this is you need me.
And I know Napoleon was critical. He's like, Fouché and his police only catch fools and lunatics, but I think he had a good spy network, and he caught these plotters of this machine plot.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right. I think Napoleon needed a strong police force in this situation.
Oh, no one ever doubted that.
Yeah.
But I think he does walk away from it at the same time thinking he's too powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And there's of course, as you know, the Ministry of Police is actually abolished at one point.
Yeah, and I'm leading up to that here.
Sure.
In the timeline, 1802, Napoleon decides that Fouché isn't vigilant enough in eliminating these threats, and he's deprived of office. Fouché is.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to me that Napoleon sent a servant to inform Fouché of his removal instead of doing it himself. And I've read that Napoleon was intimidated by Fouché, but that's somewhat hard for me to believe that Napoleon was always surrounded by intimidating people, whether it was his imperial guard or his marshals. But do you think he was somewhat he was wary of him, but do you think he was scared of Fouché?
I think he was certainly very wary of Fouché. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, he was very frightened of him. Not personally, but I think he was frightened of him in the sense of the power he wielded.
Right. Right.
He wanted this done quietly. He didn't want a big scene in the office
Mm-hmm.
because he was usually never afraid to lay it on the line, to go to somebody and say, look, and he didn't sack people very often.
No, he didn't.
He didn't, but he said, okay, now look, you moved to other duties or whatever. I'll tell you why.
But
But with Fouché, he doesn't. He stays out of the way.
yeah,
I don't think he wanted a scene. I don't think he wanted to be public.
no.
And although he might say it's because you weren't vigilant enough, I don't think that's the real reason.
But he had no problem calling people onto the carpet. He did Marshal Berthier all the time, Marshal Massena after his failure in Spain. Like, he would call people onto the carpet if he was unhappy with them.
Yeah, well, it's certainly with the military.
Mm-hmm.
That's expected. He's their commanding officer.
Mm-hmm.
But no, he's not afraid to carpet people.
Mm-hmm.
And he always gives a clear reason. But with Fouché, you see, again, remember, Fouché was there first.
Mm-hmm.
He does have the password.
True.
He does have the USB somewhere.
He has the secret files.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah.
And so make this quiet. It's not just the business of incompetence, not being vigilant enough. That is something I think he and his circle told themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The big thing is the whole ministry is being dismantled.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're looking for a change of ethos here.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to move on. The ministry police has connotations. It's the ancien regime, it's the revolution, it's the secret police. You've also got to remember that there are two police forces in France. There's Fouché's police, the civilian police, and they're not just spies and informers, as I say. They are the police force. They are the police commissioners and the agents of police commissioners, what the French call the administrative police.
Mm-hmm.
And they're quite separate from the gendarmerie. The gendarmerie have been built up by Napoleon,
Mm-hmm.
certainly since the Peace of Amiens, since about 1801. They've been a ramshackle force. He's beefed them up.
Yeah.
The gendarmerie are an arm of the army. They're all composed of military veterans.
Right.
They're all veterans of the army. They're under military discipline. They have military ranks, and they're under the Ministry of War.
Mm-hmm.
And
you needed that to put a damper on banditry and to chase down deserters, and
Yep, that's right. And so that you couldn't let the gendarmerie develop without this Ministry of Police looking over its shoulder, encroaching on it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the theory. There's also a big political thing going on, in that Fouché had a hand in executing a French aristocrat, the Duc d'Aumale, on very trumped up charges.
Yep.
It makes Napoleon very unpopular with the crowned heads of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And with the royalists. And okay, this is a way of appeasing that.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a bit of international relations at work here.
Yeah. And it's funny, though, in 1804, after Napoleon proclaims himself emperor, he reappoints Fouché as Minister of Police. So I think it's just a change of heart, or Napoleon, just the political ties. He's like, maybe I need this guy back on my team.
It's two things, yeah. One is, it's not worked.
Mm-hmm.
You're dividing up the police general's powers between interior, gendarmerie, justice. Didn't work. The other side of it, he's got a lot of dangerous people, a lot of ex-Jacobins who have lost their patron in Fouché. Fouché's out there. It's better to bring him back in. He can't do without him. Because now, Fouché is thinking, you see, you thought you could do without me, pal? You can't now. No, you can't do without me, can you? No, you can't.
Right.
And, he's got another one over on Napoleon.
Well, yeah, and I think it's interesting, now that he's back on staff, he kind of uses this time to build his power base. And Fouché's agents become omnipresent in France. And with that, his scheming becomes more powerful. And I didn't know about this story until our Talleyrand episode. In 1808, he teams up with his arch nemesis Talleyrand to discuss replacing Napoleon with Marshal Murat while Napoleon was away in Spain. And I thought that story's it's so incredible, but it sounds like something Fouché would have his hand in.
Well, look, this is all very murky. We don't know if there was really a serious plot.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know if there was a plot, how serious it was. We don't know how deep those discussions went.
Right.
But we do know that Murat was approached. Murat isn't very bright. He's got a big mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And that they wanted to get this back to Napoleon. But they'd covered their tracks. And Napoleon couldn't really do anything. Because there was nothing. No, Napoleon has his own little secret police force,
Right.
Quite independent of Fouché.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the ones who report to him that there's something going on.
Mm-hmm.
But when he presses them for details, well, there's something stirring. Murat's worked up about something. A bit of background here. 1808 is when Napoleon invades Spain.
Yeah.
Now, that was a very unpopular move with a lot of people in France.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first real time that people are saying he's gone too far. He's overextended himself. This is a needless war.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't very happy about him taking on Alexander in Lithuania in 1807, but he did win.
Mm-hmm.
And but he says, but look, that's the end of it. Yes, that's the end of it, because I've sat down with Alexander and we've made peace. We've made a deal. We're working together.
Right.
But in Spain, he goes in there and they said, look, what you've bitten off more than you can chew.
Mm-hmm.
He's never taken on as big a country as Spain at one go.
Right.
People are nervous. People don't like it. He doesn't like it himself.
Yeah, and his marshals, there's no glory there. Like Ney and the others are like, what are we doing?
He himself is unhappy politically and militarily about what he's done, but he's stuck with it. Look, we've got to get out of here. We can't get out of here.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a good time to make a move like that. If they did do something, it was almost predictable that would be the kind of time to do it. Murat is upset with Napoleon for another reason. Murat had been commander-in-chief in Spain of the French forces in Spain, about 100,000 French troops in Spain before they went to war, because Spain was a French ally.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a large French military presence, and Murat's in charge, and Murat's the military governor of Madrid. And on the 2nd of May, 3rd of May, there's a massive popular rising against the French in Madrid when they get wind that the king's been deposed.
Yep.
And Murat suppresses it with real bloodshed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you've got the famous Goya paintings.
Yep.
Of it, speak 1,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
Because Goya was a contemporary artist, of course. And, Murat goes absolutely berserk. I mean, he's like Fouché at Lyon. He's a butcher.
Yeah.
And then he says to Napoleon, right, you depose the king. How about Caroline, that's Napoleon's sister, to whom Murat's married? How about we take over as king and queen of Spain? And Napoleon says, look, after what you did in Madrid, there's absolutely no way I want you in this country.
No.
My brother Joseph's taken over. You can take over from him in Naples.
Yeah.
So, and it's not even clear at that stage that Murat's going to go to Naples.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It's not even clear that he and Caroline are going to have a role in the big reshuffle.
Right.
So Murat is obviously deeply upset. So it's the time to approach him.
Yeah. Nothing comes of it, but it's not going to be the last time Napoleon hears of Fouché scheming against him.
Oh, so
no. Napoleon's back in Paris. He gives Fouché the title of Duke of Otranto. And Napoleon often awarded titles and money to tie rivals to his government, see Bernadotte and Talleyrand. But I think after this, Napoleon was keeping a closer watch on Fouché, don't you think?
He's trying.
Yeah.
Making him Duke d'Otranto was really, I think, what would be expected.
Mm-hmm.
As you said, Talleyrand gets something like that. Bernadotte. They're all sort of, once you reach a certain level in that regime, that's what you get.
But this next one is way out of line, I think, for Fouché to even attempt this. But in 1810, Napoleon found out Fouché had been making peace overtures to Britain and again dismissed him from office, reassigning him to governor of Rome. I mean, you're basically negotiating with an enemy power under your boss's nose. So is he basically exiled to Rome?
Again, Napoleon sacks Fouché by writing him a letter. I think it was probably the happiest day of his life. He's got a cast iron excuse to do it. He's not accused of treason.
Mm-hmm.
Let's be very clear. He never accuses him of treason. He just says, you shouldn't be double dealing like this.
Mm-hmm.
You have way exceeded your remit. If anybody does this, it should be the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, don't forget, Talleyrand's gone.
Right.
Talleyrand resigns in 1808. He resigns of his own volition because he does not like the deal with Russia. He effectively resigns in 1807. He gets his marching orders. He's kept on, though, in another role. He's kept on in a role as a palace official.
Mm-hmm.
But Fouché is sent to Rome. He's partly sent to Rome. There is politics there because Rome's just been seized. The Pope has shut himself up in the Vatican. Pretty soon there's been a lot of unrest in Rome. Fouché is known to be anti-clerical.
Mm-hmm.
An appointment like that is going to lay down the law to the Pope that, from Napoleon, that I mean business.
Mm.
I found the most anti-clerical person I could find. His job's taken over by a guy called Savary.
Savary, yeah.
And Savary's a tough customer.
Mm-hmm.
Savary is a law and order gendarme, ex-army.
Yeah.
Very left-wing background.
Yeah.
In the revolution, but a professional soldier, a tough nut.
Mm-hmm.
Who Napoleon trusts, thinks he can work with. He's not as shrewd an operator as Talleyrand and as Fouché, and that suits Napoleon.
Mm-hmm.
But he's crude but effective, you might say.
Yeah.
Which Napoleon is. This is great. This is what I want.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no easy way. It's not like when he was dismissed before, where they tried to get rid of the ministry. No, it's one for one. And Savary is a guy who suits Napoleon much better.
Yeah.
He thinks he does. So there's no easy way for Fouché to get back in.
But in 1812, Fouché is again suspected of involvement in yet another conspiracy, the Malay affair, which was a failed attempt to take over the French government while Napoleon was away in Russia. And Fouché, he's almost like a scorpion. You know what he is. He's never going to stop intriguing. And he's always scheming, it seems like.
Well, was he? We don't know.
We don't know, right?
I mean, the Malay plot is now, there's been a lot of interesting work done on it. Fouché's accused of various things, but nobody tries to go after it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it'll never stand up in court.
Right.
You just know he doesn't. Was he involved? I doubt it.
Mm-hmm.
The rumor circulates that he's been killed in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now, what do we do? Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Malay coup was about, we proclaim the Republic.
Right.
Yeah. We end the empire as such. We proclaim the Republic.
Yeah.
And they garnered most support from old-fashioned Republicans. Now we know that these guys were on the same background as Fouché.
Mm-hmm.
But interesting to say that the police stay loyal. And the police are still Fouché's men.
Right.
They're still the Jacobins because Savary has a Republican background. He doesn't mess with Fouché's personnel. Fouché goes, but Savary says, it's okay. There's no purge.
Mm-hmm.
And so the police stay loyal during the Malay coup.
Interesting, yeah.
So we just don't know what happens with Fouché.
Yeah.
We just don't know.
Well, we know about the disaster in Russia. Napoleon returns and, within 2 years, he's abdicating in April 1814, which, of course, Fouché has a hand in. Does Fouché immediately serve the returning Bourbons under Louis XVIII, or do we know that before the 100 Days what he was doing?
No, he doesn't. Before the 100 Days, he's pretty much in the margins. But when Napoleon returns, he kind of revives Fouché.
Yeah.
And he sends him out to be governor of the Illyrian provinces.
Mm-hmm.
There's modern Croatia and Slovenia, which are collapsing actually pretty much in the face of the Allied onslaught.
Mm-hmm.
And he sends him out to shore that up. He can't, but he manages a good evacuation of French personnel to Venice.
Mm-hmm.
But it's partly to keep him out of the way, but also to bring him back into the fold. Napoleon is increasingly aware that I'm going to have to fall back on the old revolutionaries. I need to go back to my core support here.
Right.
The royalists are beginning to waver the closer the Allies get. So this is what he does.
Yeah.
Fouché makes overtures to Louis XVIII in 1814 when he returns. But at that stage, they don't want to know. Nobody goes after him, but they don't want to know. They keep him at arm's length. They do bring him in at a kind of a later stage, at an advisory capacity in 1840, just before Napoleon comes back from Elba. But they keep him at arm's length.
So in 1815, during the 100 Days, Napoleon again names him Minister of Police.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as Napoleon loses at Waterloo, we can kind of guess what Fouché does.
Well, Fouché plays a very careful game. This is his moment.
Yeah.
In that Napoleon brings him back as Minister of Police because it's part of a wider policy. Napoleon knows in 1815 the only people he can rely on again are the revolutionaries, the old Jacobins. You guys have seen the Bourbons in action. You know what they're like. I'm not so bad, am I? After all. Fouché fits that pattern.
Right.
Fouché, during the 100 Days, rapidly becomes the most powerful man in France. Fouché steps in and says he takes over the police, revives the old networks. Because the regime because all the ambassadors were appointed by Louis the 18th, they all just sit tight and say, we don't recognize Napoleon. We stay loyal to Louis the 18th. This is a rogue regime.
Right.
And the only way you can conduct foreign policy is through spies, through contacts, real cloak and dagger stuff. And Fouché's the one who does that. He's running foreign policy.
Right.
As well as internal policing. I mean, he's running the whole show. Only one major country recognizes Napoleon in 1815, the United States.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they're at war with Britain too.
Right.
They're the only ones who recognize him. But
it's just fascinating to me because after Napoleon's downfall, somehow Fouché is head of the provisional government and tries to negotiate with the Allies, who are probably in no mood for negotiations. And the Bourbons regain power in July 1815.
Well, what happens is I personally find this fascinating. I mean, I wrote quite a bit about it. Because Napoleon's off with the army at Waterloo, Davout's the military governor of Paris, but Fouché manages to take over the civilian administration. He manages to take over politics. He gets himself made the equivalent of Speaker of the House in Napoleon's Revolutionary Assembly. So, when Napoleon comes charging back, it's Fouché and the delegation from the assembly, which includes Lafayette, who tell him, you've got to abdicate. Because we can tell you that you don't have the backing of your own government, never mind anybody else.
Right.
And he has his tentacles everywhere. The Allies will deal with him on a certain level because he manages to get to Napoleon's brother Jerome. Jerome's married to Catherine of Württemberg, the daughter of the King of Württemberg. And Fouché manages to get to him and say, look, unless you stay away from your brother, I can't help you. You won't see your family again. These interventions are very important. But the major one is this. When Napoleon abdicates, says, okay, we'll go. Somebody's got to be in charge in Paris, John.
Right.
It's Fouché because of his position in the assembly.
Yeah.
Fouché and Davout. Fouché arranges for the army in Paris, the troops in Paris, to be paid on condition that they obey Davout's orders and withdraw from Paris into the Loire, so that Louis XVIII can come back to Paris unopposed and not in danger.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when the Allies break their agreement. The deal was that, okay, look, Fouché says, I'll get the troops paid. Once the troops are paid, they'll be happy bunnies. They'll withdraw from Paris under Davout's command out to the Loire.
Mm-hmm.
Then we'll turn them over to a royalist general, and they can all go home with money in their pockets.
Right.
Right? They got 4 days' rations and their money.
That's
everything they're owed.
That's pretty deft negotiating.
It is. And the idea is then that Louis XVIII can just come back to a city that's French, that's his,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody's going to be happy. And the Allies agree to this. Wellington and the British keep their side of the bargain. Wellington says, right, we're not going into Paris. I don't want to know about Paris. You know, let's just all sit down and drink some Norman cider and forget about it. Blucher does. Blucher brings the Prussians into Paris immediately.
Oh, yeah.
That's the first time a German army parades at the Champs-Élysées.
Right.
But Fouché is instrumental in doing all that. So when Louis XVIII comes back, it's 1799 all over again. He turns to Louis the way he turned to Napoleon to see, you're stuck with me. And he can say, you know, through the police, I can help you because you want to track down the traitors. You want to track down the unreliable people, the Jacobins, you know, who you can trust among the Bonapartists, who you can't. I'm the only one who knows that.
Right.
And this is one of the dirtiest things. I mean, Talleyrand returns with Louis,
Mm-hmm.
and Talleyrand and Fouché team up. They team up publicly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they show themselves together at court when Louis comes back.
Right.
And they get their heads together. I'll root out the troublemakers. Talleyrand will keep the Allies quiet.
Right. And
I'll root out the troublemakers. The trouble comes twofold from two different sides because he does, and he's an absolute swine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he turns in people because it gets vicious, John, because
Oh yeah.
they have elections to the new assembly.
Yeah.
That Louis has to have because of the Constitution. Now, not surprisingly, the extreme royalist right win those elections very convincingly.
Mm-hmm.
They call themselves the ultras.
Mm-hmm.
They want a witch hunt.
Yeah, it's the White Terror.
Yeah, and Fouché's feeding them all that information. He's fueling the White Terror.
Yeah, and
making himself useful.
Marshal Ney's wrapped up in it, and some other generals are thrown in jail.
To tell you the truth, massive efforts were made to try and save Ney from himself.
Oh, I know.
Ney could have escaped, but he refused. I mean,
yeah.
But the real killer one was Carnot, who served as Napoleon's Minister of War in the 100 Days. Carnot and Fouché, as I said, are old friends. I mean, that goes back to before the revolution when they met up in Arras.
Yeah.
And Carnot, Fouché provides the information that gets Carnot, you know, and the deal is they do cut a deal. You've got to go into exile. You've got to get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
So Carnot runs, and he runs to Germany, where he dies at Magdeburg. And I mean, it's a face-off when, you know, Carnot says, all right, when do you want me out of town, traitor? And Fouché looks at him and says, just as soon as you can do it, imbecile. You know, you could have come on board with me after Waterloo. You didn't.
Right.
You know, so anyway, but that's the extent it's going to. Now, but it doesn't work out well for Fouché.
No, it doesn't.
Because two things happen from completely different angles. The military governor of the whole of France and the commander of the Allied forces, but also effectively the behind-the-scenes governor, is Wellington, who's a kind of an Eisenhower figure after 1815. because France is partitioned by the four powers.
Right.
Four armies of occupation in four different parts of France. And Wellington is the overall CNC. And, Wellington more or less says in a very quiet way, but he says to Louis XVIII, and he says to Duc de Richelieu, who's taken over Fouché's post as prime minister, I don't think I'd have a lot to do with that guy if I were you. I don't think this is a good idea. Then, though, Fouché himself has got a special exemption from the government as a regicide. They won't count him. But when the ultras get the upper hand in Parliament, they say there must be no exceptions. And Fouché is a regicide and he has to be dealt with.
Right.
And so, Fouché suddenly realizes Wellington won't protect me.
Yep.
Louis in a corner. So, okay, very quickly, Talleyrand gets him made ambassador to Saxony.
Right.
But he doesn't say he's going to, the minute that he hears he's going to be recalled, I mean, he barely arrives in Dresden before he's going to be recalled. Recalled to France, you know what's going to happen to him.
Yeah. He's prescribed.
Prison at best.
Yep. Yeah.
Probably killed.
Prescribed. Yeah.
Yeah. So he disappears.
And
he goes into exile.
He dies in exile in 1820 in Italy.
In Venice. He's a near neighbor of the Bonaparte girls.
Yeah.
Bonaparte's Napoleon's sisters.
Napoleon's sisters, yeah. And I've been thinking about this question because it's a hard one to answer. And it's hard for any of my personalities, but this one in particular. What do you think his legacy is?
That is a big question. It's a very difficult one. I think, on the one hand, there is the image of how you survived the revolution. And yet he didn't quite. They got him in the end.
They did.
And I think that's what you've got to remember. He in 1815, during the 100 Days, he's the king of the castle. But when he has to collaborate with the royalists, when they're really in power, he's in a weak position all of a sudden. They are able to make the running because he is suddenly isolated. I think what is his legacy?
It's tricky because I want to give you four figures, and they all played the Game of Thrones. One of them actually got a throne, Bernadotte. He played the game, I think, quite well, as did Talleyrand's Marshal Soult, who became Marshal General of France, and Fouché. But two of those, Fouché and Bernadotte, were almost ostracized from their home country and were never able to return, and somewhat sadly died outside of their home country, France, while Soult and Talleyrand carried on their careers within France by playing their cards right. It's all very interesting to me.
Yeah, I think one of the things we haven't mentioned about Fouché in 1815 too is, again, a good replacement arrives in the form of Decazes. And Decazes has a Republican background. He's very young. He's worked in Fouché's police, but he's trusted by Louis XVIII. He's trusted by the Allies. And they realize that here is a guy who knows the ropes, who can control the police, and can fit right in, which he does. He does brilliantly. And is a moderate, and we can trust him. And therefore, Fouché suddenly, for the first time in his life, becomes dispensable.
Right.
I mean, he became dispensable under Savoy. The fall of the empire revives his career. But when it falls in 1815, he goes down with it. Really, he does.
Yeah.
He delays the end. In the end, he has no friends.
Right.
From having a huge network of collaborators and supporters, he ends his career with no friends. Bernadotte, of the four you mentioned, I think Bernadotte was lucky in that he was married de César Clary.
Right.
Otherwise, I think Napoleon would have dealt with him much more severely.
I agree.
And also, I think benefited from the fact that Napoleon was not a vicious man.
No.
After again at Arstadt, Davin and Land wanted him shot.
Right. Right.
And Napoleon said, all right, let's just forget it. I'll never really trust the guy again.
Right.
Let's just forget it. And that gives Bernadotte the chance to rebuild his whole life.
Right.
Because by chance he meets the Swedes.
Yeah.
And he, in that sense, he makes the most of his opportunities. But I think he owed a lot of that to luck.
Yeah.
To his marriage and to the fact that Napoleon was Napoleon in the best side of Napoleon.
Yeah.
The other is Talleyrand, incredibly skillful.
Yeah.
And don't forget, Talleyrand resigned. He walked.
And Marshal Soult, to his credit, he, like Ney, went along with Napoleon when he came back, but he was wise enough to get out of town, leave France for a few years, and then come back.
Yeah, he scampered to Germany.
Yeah.
But again, it depends what skills you have and whether you're replaceable.
Right.
And everyone is saying, and Wellington plays an important role here with Soult. This is a good guy.
Mm-hmm.
I fought him in Spain. Soldiers don't come better than Soult.
Right.
Now, look, there is no threat of Napoleon coming back ever again.
Mm-hmm.
He knows that. I know that. You know that. If you've got any sense, you'll take him on board.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, somebody will hire him.
Right.
And so it comes back. He is a good bloke, and it was a jolly good thing for France that he was there. Well, they have to go back into Spain in 1821. Yeah.
That's right.
2022, and he was there.
Yeah.
It depends what skills. It depends how expendable you are.
Yeah. So, getting back and just trying to wrap up on Fouché. A slippery character, a smooth operator, we discussed, a deft negotiator. Was he a benefit to France? If you ask the city of Lyon, probably not.
I think honestly, from the late Directory onwards, he's looking after his own people.
Mm-hmm. He's
looking after the police. It's a benefit to France because there are a lot of ex-Jacobins who are kept happy in the police.
Mm-hmm.
It's their niche. It's a place where someone with a Republican Jacobin past can be safely employed under Napoleon and is welcome.
Right.
In that sense, he does a lot of good work.
Mm-hmm.
He's anti-clerical. He creates a lot of problems for the Concordat, although Napoleon eggs him on in this.
Mm-hmm.
He provided a lot of invaluable information along the way.
Yeah.
But whose side is he on?
Right.
And eventually, the ultras stepped in and said to Louis XVIII, he's not on our side.
Yeah.
And they had the majority.
Yeah.
And it was over.
Yeah.
Shows how fragile it all was. And I like you, I'm not sure. I don't think he has a legacy.
Mm-hmm.
I think he has an influence on his own times, but I don't think he has a legacy.
Yeah.
I don't think you can point to anything and say, that's what he left behind.
Right. And I think that's a great way to wrap this episode up. That was incredible, my friend. I learned a lot about this guy, and I just didn't know what to think of him going in, but I learned that he was kind of a product of the times, and he was just trying to navigate, and it's a very chaotic time to navigate. And I think he was just, like everyone in this epic, just trying to do his best.
Yeah, I think again, he can't even say, if somebody would say to him, what did you do in the revolution? He can't even say what Talleyrand could, or Soult, or the other guys we've mentioned could say. I survived.
Right.
He can't even really say that.
Right. Yeah. It's just an interesting story, but I really appreciate the rundown on him. I think that was a great episode. And for those of you interested in Michael's books, I recommend independent bookstores, Amazon. Please check out Napoleon: Spirit of the Age, which is a book I'm currently reading, and I love it. And Yeah, no, Michael, thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure, John. Real pleasure to talk to you.